Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr Ron Ehrlich. Now, before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who for over 65,000 years have been custodians of this land. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Well, today we explore a wide range of topics. We cover paleo, keto, plant-based, veganism, type 1 diabetes, a whole range of topics. My guest is Drew Harrisberg. Now, I've been looking forward to getting Drew onto my podcast for some time. Drew's an exercise physiologist, a sports scientist, a diabetes educator, and most importantly, he's a happy and healthy guy thriving with type 1 diabetes. Now, we talk a lot about that in this episode. He's also an expert for functional nutrition brand Amelie, which has an essential rainbow supplement. We talk about that as well. His world shifted when he was first diagnosed at the age of 22, when he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, quite out of the blue, and we talk about that. But after making positive changes to the way that he lives, eats, moves and approaches life, he would now readily acknowledge, as he does, that he is healthier today than he is ever before his diagnosis, and he regularly shares his learning to help others on his website, Drew's Daily Dose. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Drew Harrisberg. Welcome to the show, Drew.
Thank you for having me. Finally, we get to do this. It's been a long time coming.
We do. We've been talking about this for years, and I guess both our busy schedules, yours more than mine, has precluded us from doing it. But here you are, and welcome. Now, listen, we hear a lot about vegetables. It's kind of the foundation of, healthy eating, and it's often a must in most diets. And we're told to eat the rainbow. What is eating the rainbow? What's a rainbow diet, and why is it good for your health?
Yeah, I think like the public health messaging around fruit and vegetables has been something that we've heard about for decades and decades and decades. But I just think that the general population is that good at adhering to the guidelines of fruit and veg intake, generally speaking. Especially now, like the social media landscape has almost changed people's minds about fruit and veg in some cases. Some people think they're actually bad for you. But I think the public health messaging has been great. It's try to eat as many plants and fruit and vegetables as possible, but trying to eat 5 vegetables and 2 pieces of fruit per day or whatever it was just wasn't working. And I think a more digestible message is this idea of a rainbow diet, meaning instead of trying to just think about your food as 5 vegetables, 2 fruit per day as a minimum, go for color. Like create a bowl of food that has so much plant diversity that it hits all the colors essentially of the rainbow. And the idea behind it is that each unique food with a unique color comes with different phytonutrients. So red foods have different phytonutrients to purple foods, to green foods, orange foods. So it's just I think it's just a really nice, easy message for people to understand. You're going to get more fiber, you're going to get more colors, you're going to get more phytonutrients, but you don't have to just focus on specific fruit and vegetables. Just think about that rainbow, creating a beautiful rainbow plate or bowl.
And how would we do that? How do we up our phytonutrients intake? How do they even benefit us? We hear about phytonutrients and colors, but why are they so important?
Yeah, I think the phytonutrients are basically these compounds or chemicals in plants that occur naturally and have systemic benefits across the body for different sort of things. So again, going back to that idea of the rainbow, different phytonutrients will play different roles within the body. I think as a baseline understanding, it's if you do eat the rainbow, you're setting yourself up for pretty good health, as a baseline. So if you think about a diet, whether it's a keto diet, whether it's a paleo, plant-based, if the foundation is plant heavy, you're setting yourself up for some success long-term. The macronutrients may vary. Some people can do a low-carb version or a high-fat version or a low-fat version. That, to me, I'm a bit agnostic when it comes to the macronutrients in some ways. I just think that plant diversity, fiber, the most important things. But if you're coming from, say, like a standard Australian diet or a standard Western diet, and then you all of a sudden up your fiber intake, you might find that you have some pretty bad digestive issues in terms of bloating and gas, which is not necessarily a sign of poor health. It may just be a sign of gut health and your ability to tolerate these new foods and fibers. But in that case, like, I think people can supplement with different types of foods that will allow them to get these nutrients in other ways. So I'm an ambassador for a meal, and they have a product, Essential Rainbow. And the whole idea behind this product was for people who can't just overnight switch to this rainbow diet and craft this perfect diet and bowl and plate. You can take a daily supplement in powder form that will give you basically the nutrients of the rainbow in that one sort of intake. And they now have like sachets, you can take it with you on the go. So they're just trying to make it easier to get these nutrients. But I always think go for the whole foods first, lean on supplements when you need to.
Yeah, no, I totally agree about the whole foods. I remember doing a program with Professor Fred Provenza, who wrote a terrific book called Nourishment, and he made a statement which kind of blew me away, and it said, the humble strawberry is a good example. It has 5,000 active nutrients. We only know what 4 or 5 or 10 of them do, but the fact that nature has packaged them all up, there's got to be value there somewhere.
Right. And I think that's such a good point about looking at outcomes rather than, dialing in specifically on a nutrient or a micronutrient, but rather looking at what is the harder health outcomes of eating certain dietary patterns. So like plant-heavy diets have really good health outcomes long-term, whilst, it's not, we don't need to be hyper-focused on every phytonutrient in the diet, but rather just that overall pattern of eating. I think that's the most important part of it.
I think one of the interesting things about vegetables, though, because they are stationary, because they don't move around, and yet they need to protect themselves, there are some chemicals within vegetables that, are potentially a problem. I mean, I know gluten gets a lot of publicity, lectins, another one, oxalates, phytates, there are downsides too, aren't there?
Yeah, I think that, again, like if we look at mechanisms like lectins or oxalates, whilst theoretically they may, inhibit absorption of certain nutrients, or they may cause some digestive upset or something like that, if you zoom out and actually look at harder outcomes in terms of health outcomes, cardiovascular disease risk, cancer risk, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, generally speaking, the body of literature points to more vegetables is actually better for long-term health. And I do think that it probably differs between individuals. Like some individuals are more sensitive to other foods than other people. So I would encourage people to sort of figure out what your personal thresholds are for different foods. But just like as a general guide, a plant-heavy diet with vegetables and fruit is a really healthy way to eat, even though there are these lectins, oxalates, these natural chemicals that are in the plants. It seems that they may even be like a hormetic stressor, so a healthy stressor on the body that's so low dose, like the dose makes the poison, basically. So like at a really high dose, yes, probably very bad for us. But at very low doses, it actually seems to be beneficial. So, it is tricky zooming in on lectins and oxalates, because I think that if we just look at whole foods, generally speaking, the health outcomes are pretty good.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the people that are probably most susceptible are people with autoimmune conditions. I mean,
yeah.
I think that's the case. It's a broad statement, that one. But anyway, listen, you mentioned macronutrients, and I think that is an interesting one because, of course, plant-based diets are becoming very popular. Vegan diets are becoming very popular. And I know we did a program with gastroenterologist Pran Yoganathan, who made the point that nowadays protein requirements have actually gone up, particularly as we get older. It used to be something like 0.8 of a gram per kilogram of weight. I could never work that out, so I always went 1 gram per kilogram of weight. Yeah. That was easy. Yeah. I'm 80 kilograms. I need 80 grams of protein a day. Now, he says, it's more like 1.5 or 1.6 grams, so that's 1.5. I would need 120 grams of protein a day, particularly at my age. That becomes a little bit of a challenge in a purely plant-based diet. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the dietary recommendations of 0.8, they came from my understanding of the literature. They came about as the baseline to avoid protein deficiency. So we're not talking about like optimizing bone mineral density, muscle mass. It's just like baseline nitrogen balance. It's actually lower, but they bump it up. It's probably 0.6 in the studies, but they bump it up to 0.8 just to be sure that they cover everybody.
Right.
It is too low for older people, elderly population. Their anabolic response to protein is lower at a given gram for gram basis. So as you get older, you probably do need more. And I actually think 1.2 grams per kilogram of protein is sort of the optimal number for somebody who's a little bit older. If you're looking to optimize muscle mass, bone density, if you're an athlete and performance, I actually think the research is pretty clear that 1.6 grams per kilogram seems to be the anabolic ceiling by which 1.8 grams or 2 grams per kilo doesn't seem to benefit you that much more. So it's like the sweet spot, 1.6 grams per kilo. That's what I currently eat. But in terms of getting that protein in a plant-based diet, so I'm 85 kilos and I'm getting 1.6 grams per kilogram. So
wow,
I'm eating, let's just call it 150 grams of protein a day, sometimes more, sometimes a little bit less, but on average about 150. I get most of my protein from whole food sources, so legumes, tempeh, tofu, but I'm not opposed to supplementing with protein so that I can hit these targets. So the way I look at it is, if you can hit your targets with whole foods, plant-based whole foods, then that's great. I mean, you can go for it, eat a plant-based diet, but you may need to eat a little bit more than the recommended numbers of, say, 1.2, because plant protein is slightly less bioavailable. Very small amounts, but a few percent points less bioavailable. But again, when you look at the research of, say, an omnivore diet versus a plant-based diet, there's studies, directly comparing the two diets and outcomes like muscle mass, bone density, ability to, create hypertrophy in the muscles from resistance training. There seems to be almost no difference between the two diets when protein is equated. The one study that I'm thinking of, a very recent one, I think it came out last year, was looking at an omnivorous diet, a healthier version of an omnivorous diet supplemented with a whey protein shake, and then a plant-based diet supplemented with I think it was a soy-based protein shake. Outcomes were there was no difference in muscle mass, bone density, performance, strength, any of those kinds of things. So what I took away from that, and I already had known that from my experience being plant-based for 5 years, is that you can build actually plenty of muscle in a plant-based diet as long as you hit your protein targets. And if you have a hard time doing it by eating, lentils and beans and chickpeas and quinoa and those kinds of things and tempeh and tofu, then just protein powder supplement is, it can be a really good tool to just add to the toolkit. Some people are opposed to it because it's processed, but I just think in the scheme of a diet that's, 85% whole foods, getting an extra 30 grams of protein a day from a powdered source that is rich in essential amino acids, really easy to digest and consume, I think it's just, for me, it's a no-brainer. It's a beneficial thing to add in.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's become a dirty word in public health, but meat has been with us for quite a while. And I know that, like, for example, pork, lamb, beef, chicken, lamb and beef, about a third of the weight of the food is protein.
Yeah.
So for 100 grams, 30 grams or 33 grams is protein.
Yeah.
When it comes to lentils, it's about 10%. Correct. So for me to hit 1.5, 150 grams of protein a day, I would need to be eating 1.5 kilos of lentils a day, or other legumes, which would really be an interesting challenge.
Yeah, challenge is the right word. It's so the way that I look at it is, thankfully, we don't get all of our protein from one food source. It adds up from multiple different food sources, right? So there's so many different legumes that you can eat, and you don't have to eat as you say, 1.5 kilos of lentils a day to get your protein.
Just picturing that is kind
and
of
you think about the GI discomfort that would come with all of that fiber. But it's an interesting point you make, because it actually brings up two benefits of the plant-based diet from that perspective. Is that the protein in a plant-based diet comes with fiber. And if people are already fiber deficient, because a lot of people's diets are fiber deficient, they're not eating enough plants. If they can shift some of their animal protein to plant protein, they're going to get more fiber in the diet. So that's a tick. That's a net positive. But again, like in this day and age, we're so lucky to have foods that are fortified with protein. So there's so many plant-based, your typical plant-based foods that are now very high in protein. For example, the pasta that I eat, which I actually had for dinner last night, is extremely low carb, but it's made of beans. And it's like a bean-based or legume-based pasta, which has 44 grams of protein per serve. and the serving size is not that big. I think it's only about 100, maybe 120 grams. So, I like to lean on those foods because, as you say, I could not eat kilograms of beans all day to get my protein. So I do lean on the fortified foods. There's even breads where you can get like 30 grams of protein for only like 4 grams of carbs for 2 slices of bread. So there are great products if people want to lean on those. But if you do want to eat, say, a strictly whole food plant-based diet with no, bean-based pastas and none of these fortified breads or pea milks or protein milks, then you do have to kind of accept that it's going to take time before you can tolerate such large amounts of these plant protein sources because of the fiber that's coming with it.
Another one that we hear a lot about is, protein is one challenge. Another one is the fats, because, we talk about essential amino acids. Actually, before we leave proteins, essential amino acids, there are 20 amino acids, and I think 8 or 9 of them we cannot make ourselves. So we have to consume them. Hence, they are referred to as essential amino acids. And again, coming back to that old food meat, it's kind of packaged up by nature for us. That's one of the challenges too, isn't it, really? We're getting the combination that allows you to get all of those 8 or 9 essential amino acids. How do you approach that?
Yeah, the key word you said there is the combination. So
yes.
So all plants contain all of the essential amino acids, but just to varying amounts. So whole grains are more deficient in, say, a particular amino acid than legumes. So as long as you're eating diversity and combining over the day, and it doesn't have to mean one meal, like you don't have to combine grains and legumes every meal because the body can pool amino acids within the muscle. So all you have to do is eat a diversity of plant-based protein foods, and you're going to get all the essential amino acids you need because they're all of the essential amino acids are in all of the plants, just to varying amounts. So if you only got your protein from quinoa or only got your protein from lentils, you'd probably run into some problems. So I'm always encouraging people to think about, again, just coming back to sort of the rainbow, thinking about diversity as like the king of a plant-based diet. If you don't have diversity, you can run into issues. And if you're worried that you don't have the same nutritional literacy to actually plan a well-planned plant-based diet, that's when I lean on supplementation. And then, like a multivitamin, if you're not planning your meals properly, if you're not combining all of the different foods over the day, then I would lean on supplementation just to like fill those gaps.
And is the same, and that's the protein part, and I know B12 is another one which I think would be covered with supplementation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other one would be essential amino acids, because the essential omega-3, the so-called anti-inflammatory, omega-6 being pro-inflammatory, and in nature they tend to be in balance. But omega-3 comes in various forms, the EPA, the DHA, the ALA. How do we get that EPA and DHA in a plant-based diet?
So when it comes to the essential fatty acids, if you're leaning on whole foods, for example, flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds, walnuts, you're getting ALA. But everybody converts ALA differently, right? So I recently did a podcast with a good friend of mine, Simon Hill, who has a podcast, The Proof. It's brilliant. He's a nutritionist. We were talking about how there's this sort of like omega-3 index. You can do a test to see whether you're a high converter or a low converter of ALA and what your baseline index is. Some people convert enough whole food into the EPA DHA and they seem to be totally fine. Some people don't. And that's again where I say we can lean on supplementation, and I take an algae oil supplement. So if you're a vegan, obviously you don't want to eat fish oil, but algae oil is the EPA DHA in that form because that's where the fish get it from, the algae. So you're basically going straight to the source. In fact, Emil, the company I was mentioning before, they have an omega supplement that's algae derived, and another one called Essential 8, which is also an algae-based omega-3 supplement. So I do think that you can eat a plant-based diet and have perfectly fine omega profile. However, it does depend on the individual and how you convert ALA into the different form fatty acids. In which case, again, I just say take a supplement. Like anyone who's vegan, B12, absolute must, just to bulletproof the diet. And I would say probably an algae oil supplement. Those two are a very good idea for anyone who's vegan. Can you get your B12 from fortified foods, yes, but you have to, again, be planning and making sure that you're consuming those foods regularly. And if you slip up or forget, then again, just having that B12 supplement is just bulletproofs to that.
You mentioned the word vegan, and I know we talked about this before you came on, that you've been fully plant-based vegan for the last 5 years?
Yeah, I'd say I wouldn't say vegan, to be honest, but plant-based, yes.
Okay, that's interesting. So you would still include eggs and dairy in your
So
diet?
what I do is, at home, I'm 100% plant-based, no animal products at all. But I guess you could call it like an opportunistic omnivore. So, like, for example, family gatherings, big family dinner, there's a buffet laid out. Some people are plant-based in my family, some aren't. I mean, and looking at like the science, I think that a Mediterranean style diet is a very healthy diet. I think that fish is good for health outcomes. If there's fish on the table and I know that it's going to end up in the bin, I won't let that happen. I'll eat the fish. But I don't go out and order fish at restaurants, and I don't cook it at home. But, at these events where it's either in the bin or, I can eat it, I'm going to choose to eat it, because I still want to have, I want to be healthy for me, but I also am thinking about the planet and food waste and all these kinds of things. So for me, that's like been a bit of a tug of war. It's like, am I 100% vegan, or am I plant-based and opportunistic? And I would say I'm probably a bit more opportunistic.
Because I have, there's kind of a couple of questions, and I'd be really interested to hear your response to these when I go down this plant-based, like predominantly plant-based / mostly vegan approach. There's a question that I just still haven't quite, got a reasonable answer for, and that is, about 6 million years ago, we separated from the chimps and the gorillas. And at that point, we shared a cranial capacity of 400 cc's, that gave us a brain size. And then we started a journey. I mean, Homo habilis was 700 cc's, Homo erectus 1,000 cc's. By the time we got to anatomically modern humans, we were 1,450 or 1,500 cc's, almost 3 times the size cranial capacity. How do you think that happened?
Yeah, I think I know where you're going with this. So I think this is what I'm reading, is that the introduction of eating cooked food. So we have fire. We started to cook our meat. We were able to liberate nutrients that perhaps we wouldn't before in the raw form, which potentially, I wasn't there 6 million years ago, but maybe the brain started to evolve differently, having access to nutrients that we couldn't get before. And I think that line of thinking around evolution is interesting. I definitely am interested by it. But what I find a bit more compelling is, what do we know today? And because I don't know about the last 6 million years. I'm not an anthropologist or an archaeologist or anything like that. But what we do know today is that you can eat a fully plant-based diet, especially if you're not eating an entirely raw plant-based diet. So I am a proponent of a cooked plant-based diet, because, going back to what we were talking about before, if you eat raw beans or raw grains, the lectins in that will cause some serious troubles. But the good thing about cooking and sprouting and fermenting and soaking is that it destroys the lectins there's so little of them left that it's insignificant. So you can pretty much destroy all of those lectins with cooking. So I think that cooking is very important if you're on a plant-based diet. And if you want to get enough protein, those protein sources need to be cooked, essentially. But going back to sort of what we know today is that you can eat a fully plant-based diet, you can get enough protein, and the health outcomes are really good. So there's lots of sort of longer-term literature now showing that you can live into your up to centenarians even. If you look at the blue zones of the world, even though they're not 100% plant-based, but if we talk about plant-based as like a predominant plant-based diet, meaning maybe 85% or 90% of your calories coming from plants, you have less disease, live longer, healthy body weight. So I think that we do know a lot about what we can do today, and the health outcomes are really good. But looking back through that evolutionary lens is interesting, and it definitely does raise questions. But I just go back to the outcomes that we can show today with really good long-term science.
Oh well, I think the increase in brain size was a significant. I mean, when we look at our impact on the world at 400 cc's and 1450. It's pretty obvious. But another question that I have is also, is there a culture in human history that has thrived generation after generation on a vegan diet?
I don't know about through human history, because if you look back at human history and evolution, it was essentially there were two main things that needed to happen: survive, right, stay alive, and reproduce. But once you pass the age
Yes.
of reproduction, the survival and longevity piece is no longer important, right? So we don't actually care if you're going to live to 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 if you've passed your genes on and you now have offspring in the world, and we're keeping this, moving on. So did people live a long life on an exclusively plant-based diet, or were there even people eating only plants? Probably not, because it wasn't a matter it was a matter of survival. So it wasn't a matter of picking and choosing how to create these diets. It was, we need to survive, we need to reproduce. So if you can eat animals and catch animals, you've got to do it. But calories are sparse. We just need to eat when we can. But luckily for us, today we don't have to worry about that. So in this day and age, we can formulate and plan a really well-planned plant-based diet where we get all the nutrients we need, all of the protein that we need to really thrive on it. And I don't think that we need to always compare to where we came from if what we know today is actually pretty strong evidence that it can be done in a really helpful way.
Anyway, I think there are just it's some challenges, and actually another challenge that I see, because I have 5 grandchildren varying in age from 2 to 8 at the moment, and getting vegetables into them is a challenge.
Right.
And it's interesting to look at kids' development, and it's interesting also because one of the things about feeding a kid meat is that it's kind of all packaged up there and it's pretty straightforward. And they're almost like, to me, kids, this is why we do so many programs on kids' health. To me, they're the canaries in the coal mine.
Yeah.
We learn a lot from kids and how vulnerable they are.
Yeah, I agree. I think that even though I think that the Dietitians Association, or one of the major nutrition associations, came out that you can basically eat a healthy plant-based diet at all age groups for the course of your life. I think that when it comes to kids, it's a bit more difficult. I also think that, it's hard enough for a kid to eat 3 pieces of fruit or vegetables, let alone the entire diet. So I can probably go on record saying this. I don't know if it is the best idea to enforce a vegan diet on a kid if it's not well planned, if you don't know what you're doing. Can you supplement with, nutrient, like an essential rainbow supplement where you sneak it into their smoothies and you get 77 nutrients just snuck in there and it tastes good and they don't even know what's in there? Great, you can do that, but it doesn't mean that they have to be on a plant-based diet as a child. I think that, as you say, like meat, fish, eggs, these foods are nutrient dense. They have a lot of nutrients in them. And when you're a growing child who also needs a lot of calories, I think it's a good thing to have in there. Can you do a plant predominant omnivorous diet? Sure. Yeah, I think that's amazing. But I just don't know if, enforcing veganism on kids is the way to go necessarily. Some people do it great, though. There are families and kids who have been vegan since birth and have done great. So I don't know.
I think one of the other challenges is when we get into reproductive health, in the years of reproduction, that forms another. Because there you've got the double whammy of a young woman or a woman with a growing fetus, embryo. The whole story is happening there. So that's another area that needs kind of a little bit more nuance. Don't you think?
No, I do agree with that. I think that there are experts in that field that know way more than me. I know it is possible. I know there are absolutely people who have been vegans as a mother who, is pregnant and their child has lived basically their whole life as a vegan and are perfectly healthy. But I think it requires a degree of nutritional literacy and understanding of how to formulate a healthy diet. What are the key nutrients of focus? Like, you can't just throw your hands up in the air and pretend it's all good. Like, you actually do need to focus on some key things for brain development and body, all of those sorts of things. So yeah, I think if people really wanted to go down that path, I would speak to an expert who can help you to formulate that. And if your kid, you're going to run into other hurdles and barriers, like, as you were saying, some kids just don't want to eat the foods that you put in front of them. in which case you need ways around those barriers.
Now, Drew, I know your background is exercise physiology, and we recently had the pleasure of Michael Mosley joining us, and he did many programs on intermittent fasting, but also on high-intensity intermittent training. And I'm just interested to know what your thoughts on that are. How do we define it for those that may not be aware of it? And how much is enough?
Yeah, I think this area of research is fascinating. I think it popped onto the scene probably, a couple of decades ago, and it was a big buzzword. And it seems to still be a pretty big buzzword because I think the proof is in the pudding. It's very beneficial. It's a very efficient way to improve your cardiorespiratory fitness or your VO2 max. So if we sort of take a step back and think about how to first define it, so HIIT or high intensity interval training is essentially hard bouts of work followed by intervals of rest. And you repeat the cycle so that the idea is that during your work period, you get your heart rate very elevated. And then in the rest period, it comes down. So your ability to produce high power output efforts is better than if you just did steady state continuous training for, say, 60 minutes. Now, they're both really good. So the literature sort of splits them off into two main areas: moderate intensity continuous training or steady state training. So that's like, say, 45 or 60 minutes or longer at a steady state with no rest, just say pedaling on a bike or going for a run, right? A cardiovascular form of training, versus this interval style training where you've got high intensity intervals or even sprint intervals, which are even more like super maximal efforts for very short periods, 10 to 20 seconds, followed by multiple minutes of rest, right? Now, to define whether or not you're actually doing HIIT properly, it comes down to your heart rate. So if you are getting your heart rate above 85% of your max heart rate during the working effort, that would qualify as effective HIIT training. If your heart rate is not getting near 85 and it's, say, 60 or 70, you're not going hard enough. So it's hard and it hurts, but it's over quick. And that's the benefit of HIIT, is that you get your heart rate up to this 85% of the max. You try to hold it there for not as long as you can, but there are different protocols. And then in the rest, it's going to come down. It'll drop below 85%. It might hover down. If you're very fit, it'll come down quickly to a lower heart rate. If you're unfit, it'll stay up around that sort of zone of 80, 75. So the idea is your workout is shorter. So it's a more time efficient way to produce really good benefits in terms of VO2 max. And VO2 max is sort of the term it basically describes your ability to take in oxygen and utilize it within the body. People with high VO2 max have a really, really strong correlation with health and longevity and reductions in all-cause mortality. So the better your cardiorespiratory fitness, the higher your VO2 max, the better your odds are of living a longer life with less complications and less disease, right? So it's a great way to get to that goal of improving your VO2 in less time. So if you were comparing moderate intensity continuous training to HIIT training, you can achieve the same VO2 max in about 10 minutes less time per session on average. So it's a great...
Right. You mentioned VO2 max a couple of times, and just remind us about how that's calculated. What does VO2 max... I mean, I know what it is, but I'd just like to remind our listener what it is.
So, I mean, the way of calculating it is actually a little bit tricky. You go into a lab and you attach a device to your face, and you're basically breathing into a machine that's calculating how much oxygen you're able to take in and utilize. You can do sort of like field-based proxy tests to see whether or not you have a good VO2. And you might remember, I'm sure you did this, the beep test from school back in the day. The beep test is where you do a shuttle test. So you're running from cone to cone and you're listening to a track that's basically sounding a beep. And every time you get to the cone, you have to turn around, wait for the beep, run back. And it gets quicker and quicker every minute or so. That's sort of like a proxy way to see your VO2 max. And it's correlated quite well with the lab tests. But essentially, like when it comes down to your HIIT training, like there are so many different protocols. One of the most famous is called the 4x4 protocol, which means you're doing 4 minutes of hard work, trying to keep your heart rate above 85%. Then you have 3 minutes of active rest at about 60% of your max heart rate, and you do that 4 times. That is a more advanced protocol. 4 minutes of work is a long time to be working. There are other protocols which are 1 minute of work, 1 minute of rest for 10 rounds. So that's a little bit different. And then there's others that are like 30 seconds of work with a couple minutes of rest. But the minimum dose, according to there was a meta-analysis that came out, I think it was 2020. The minimum effective dose for HIIT training is 30 seconds of work interval, accumulating 5 minutes of time in that heart rate zone that I was saying, 85% of your max. So it's only 5 minutes of total work at 85% of your max. That seems to be the minimum effective dose. But the optimal dose is actually with longer intervals, because it takes time to get your heart rate to 85. And then if you can keep it there for a minute, 2 minutes, maybe even 3 minutes, then you're accumulating more time in that higher zone, and it seems to be a bit better long term. So longer intervals of greater than 2 minutes, 2 to 4 minutes, and for up to about 15 minutes of time in that high heart rate zone. That's sort of like the best bang for your buck.
One of the things that I remember from hearing or watching the program with Michael Mosley was when he said 10 to 15 minutes of high interval training, high interval intensity training will up your metabolism for 24 to 48 hours, whereas a 10-kilometre run will do that for 6 to 8 hours. I thought, wow, That's a hell of a statement.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, okay, when we look at...
Is that true? Do you think that's... would you agree with that?
It is true in theory. So it's called EPOC, excess post-oxygen consumption. So when you do high-intensity interval training, the EPOC effect is higher, meaning that you essentially are burning more energy after the session than doing a moderate intensity continuous session, as you were saying, sort of like a long run.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. You actually burn, over the course of 24 hours, they look at these exact studies looking at a moderate intensity continuous training versus a HIIT workout, and they look at 24-hour energy consumption, and they're the same. So there seems to be a compensatory effect of when you're doing the moderate intensity training for 60, 70, 80 minutes, you're burning more total calories in that workout because you're training for 80 minutes. Whilst a HIIT session may be over in 15 minutes, 16 minutes. So you're burning less energy in the HIIT workout, but more in EPOC after. But the net effect is that they end up being the same. So with the moderate intensity, you burn less after, but you're burning more in the workout. So over 24 hours, they end up being basically the same. But that EPOC effect is real. You do have this like afterburn effect. I just don't think it's clinically meaningful enough to like create fat loss long term compared to moderate intensity. They seem to be pretty similar.
And remind me, you said it, EPOC stands for?
Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So it's basically explaining your entire system is working over time to clear the metabolites of that workout, and it does it by using oxygen essentially. So you're setting your body up to, obviously our bodies want to be at homeostasis, right? You do this HIIT workout, and all of a sudden you've got all of these metabolites and byproducts of the training that built up. Then in the next, say, 24 hours, your body is working to clear it and bring you back to homeostasis. And that's what sort of EPOC is.
Interesting. Another public health message that I know we hear a lot about, and it rolls off the tongue very easily because it seems to be so logical, a bit like fat makes you fat, is calories in, calories out. The reason we are fat is because we put too many calories in and there's not enough calories going out. What do you think? What do you think of that as a public health?
I think that message is, like, if you think where it comes from is the laws of thermodynamics. So people will say you cannot violate the laws of thermodynamics. It's an energy in, energy out, or calories in, calories out. I think it can be, while I think it is true, I think it can be just a misleading way of thinking about it, because some people will say to you, but I'm not eating that many calories. Like, I promise you, I'm only eating 1,000 calories a day and I'm gaining weight, I'm getting fat. So it can't be calories in, calories out. So what I would say is, in that case, a better framing of it is energy stored versus energy burnt. Because yes, that person is only eating 1,000 calories, but for some reason, their body is storing more calories than they're burning. So I think that calories in, calories out, energy in, energy out, it is true as a law of thermodynamics, but I just think that the way it's packaged isn't very digestible for people, because they're like, but I'm not even eating that much. But I think that at the end of the day, if you are gaining weight, at some point you have to be storing more than you're burning. I think I think everyone would agree on, whether you think calories in, calories out is true or not. If you're storing more than you're burning, you're going to gain weight. Even if that means that the calories in part of the equation is very small, like 1,000 calories a day is very, very small. It just means that the calories out is not exceeding the calories in. That's the sort of way that I think about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. The idea.
Well, I think this thermodynamic law is great in a closed system. I don't know that the human body necessarily just fits into that simple mode, and I think it's kind of led to a lot of, I got to do more exercise, which we all agree we've got to do. We need to move more, but it just seems to be a little bit oversimplistic, and hasn't seemed to work terribly well.
Yeah, so the calories out part or the expenditure part, exercise is one way, but it's actually not. It's not. I mean, I'm an exercise physiologist, and I think exercise is unbelievably healthy and it's amazing.
Yeah.
But as a
Yeah,
fat
absolutely.
loss tool, it's actually not that strong of a lever to pull. The best lever you can pull is to affect the other part of the equation, which is the in-calorie part. So in standard Western diet or standard American diet, the calories in is just in the thousands of calories. It's just building up, and the expenditure is very low. If you try to out-eat those calories coming in by exercising, you'd be running all day. Like it's so hard to burn 1,000 calories, but it's so easy to not eat the 1,000 calories in many cases. It's also very easy to eat 1,000 calories in many cases, right? But my point is the ease of eating 1,000 calories in this environment, this obesogenic environment that we live in this modern world, to out-exercise the ease of eating those 1,000 calories, you got to be working out for hours every day. And it's just, people aren't adhering to that. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I thought the other thing that I felt was wrong was this preoccupation with calories. Calories are calories are calories. There are different sorts of calories. For example, if you ate fat, a lot of fat, healthy fats, then it's a bit like putting, this is one of our guests that I've had frequently on is Nora Gedgaudas. And Nora's analogy is your metabolism is like a fire. And if you put a big log on the fire, as in you eat healthy fat, that is going to burn all day and you're not going to be hungry. And yes, that is how one way of going. The other is to go on a low fat approach and a high carb approach because you're hungry and you're sitting in front of the fire, constantly throwing kindle onto it, but in the process accumulating the calories in. So I think this is why the calories in, calories out kind of reduces things to macronutrient idea. Whereas I think there's something about a low carb approach versus a low calorie approach that is more sustainable.
Yeah,
What do you think of
yeah.
that?
I think that whether it's low carb or low fat, whether it, as you say, like for example, protein has a higher thermic effect than fat, right? So when you eat protein, 20% of the calories that you take in, so 100 calories on your plate of protein may only end up as 80 calories in your body. So there's this effect where you're losing some of those calories in metabolizing it. So you can't say all foods are equal. All calories are equal because calories are a unit of energy or a unit of heat. So that we know. But where the calories come from will be a bit different. So the calories on your plate don't always end up exactly as what it is in your body because they have different thermic effects. High fiber foods have a higher thermic effect than, say, drinking pure oil, right? There's very low thermic effect. You're just eating, it's liquid calories or soft drink, say. Liquid calories coming in, low thermic effect. You're not getting that like loss of calories in the digestion of it. I do think that the comparison of low carb to low fat is interesting. I've been very successful on both. I was paleo low carb for 7 years, and I did it to manage my type 1 diabetes. And then I went plant-based, high carb, lower fat, not low fat. I don't actually think that a low fat diet is that healthy for us. I think that a good baseline of, for me, it's probably, I'd say I'm getting, say, 30 to 40% of my calories from fats in whole food forms, olive oil, walnuts, nuts and seeds, avocado, those kinds of things, soy products, tempeh tofu. But I think that having fat in the diet is very important. No one, I don't think anyone really can deny that at this stage. I think it's pretty clear that it's good for you. Look at Mediterranean style diets, whether it's rich in nuts or olive oil or fish, seems to be very healthy and good for people. But I think that when you look at low carb versus low fat, there are people that respond really well to low carb diets, and there's people that respond really well to lower fat diets. And what it comes down to really is the individual who is eating the diet. Because Christopher Gardner did that study, I'm sure you're aware of it, where they put, it was a very healthy omnivorous diet versus a very healthy plant-based diet. So not like a vegan diet with like fake meats and all that kind of thing. Whole food, plant-based diet, omnivorous diet, comparing the two. From memory, and I'll have to dig up the study, go back to it, I'm pretty sure it was isocaloric, or at least the macronutrients were matched, certain macronutrients were matched, but very similar diets. And they were looking at adherence rates and what the outcomes were in these people. And it was a crossover design. So you do both diets. Some people did great low carb, some people did great low fat, but overall, they seem to be pretty much the same in terms of weight management over time, body composition, so body fat, lean mass, all of these things seem to be very, very similar over time, depending on what you could stick to the best. So again, I think the individual approach is very important. Some people can be on keto diet for years, others can't even do it for a couple of months. So it just depends on the individual and what you can do.
Well, I can imagine, Drew, knowing how qualified and obsessed with health you are, you would be an example of someone who gives a great deal of thought to the combinations of foods that you put in your mouth. You mentioned plant-based meats, and I must say I recently went to a restaurant with a friend who was a group of us, and he was vegetarian, and we actually ordered plant-based meats, which I never, ever would do. And I just did it out of interest, and I was shocked to see how much like pork or beef or chicken they were. And it just struck me that this has got to be the ultra of ultra-processed foods, plant-based meats. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think they have their place depending on the individual. I think that if you're somebody who is an ethical vegan and you stopped eating meat because of the ethics, but not because of the flavor. I mean, at the end of the day, like, a lot of people are vegan, but they still love the taste of beef, pork, bacon, cheese, eggs, all of these things. Then I think that having something for those people to eat is good. Because again, if we go back to imagine a diet that's 85% whole foods, rich in fruits and vegetables, eating the rainbow, nuts and seeds, huge diversity. And then 5% of the diet is, say, a plant-based meat product, once or twice a week. I just think that that long term, I don't think that you're going to see a huge difference between the person that eats, one piece of plant-based meat once a week versus the person who's strictly whole foods. I think that the foundation of that 85% big base of rainbow foods is what makes people healthy. And there's even studies looking at red meat intake and the way that when it's paired with a diet that's rich in fruits and vegetables, it can offset some of the potential negative effects of high red meat intake. So we know that fruits and veggies are protective. So I think that, like, even if it is a processed version of meat or fake meat, whatever you want to call it, I just think within the context of that kind of plant-heavy diet, I don't see it as a huge problem. Personally, I don't tend to eat those products or lean on them too often. I think they can taste really good and they can trick you to thinking you're actually eating meat, which is quite amazing.
Oh, yeah.
But I think, like, again, if we go back to, let's say, the protein part of the earlier conversation, if you transition to a vegan or plant-based diet, you are trying to build your tolerance, but you're struggling to eat enough protein. And a plant-based alternative is a good way for you to get at least that baseline of essential amino acids to at least hit, let's say, the 0.8 to 1 gram per kilo of body weight. Then again, it's just a tool that you can lean on. Should you eat it 3 times a day, every day? Probably not. But I think that every now and then, I think it can be included in a healthy diet.
Yeah. I can't help but feel that well-meaning vegans are becoming the unwitting foot soldiers of an ultra-processed food industry with the meat, plant-based meats. And I know that meats are demonized. Red meat is seen to be pro-inflammatory. But I know, and we've done many, many programs on this, there is a big difference between industrialized meat production, which I totally agree with. The most ardent vegan I would agree with is unconscionable. What is bad for the animal is bad for us and bad for the planet, but the corollary is also true. What is good for the animal is good for us and good for the planet, but that's a whole other discussion. Listen, I just want to finish up, well, we all lead busy lives, right? And what would be some tips for maintaining wellness, for us all trying to lead a busy life. But give us some 3, 4, 5 tips on how to improve our wellness.
Okay, I think we actually we covered a couple of them really well.
Yes.
I think that reframing our mindset away from too focused on macronutrients, becoming too tribal in, is it low carb, is it keto, is it high fat, is it plant-based, and just think about diversity of plants. I think that rainbow idea is something that will serve a lot of people. So try to get as many colors and diversity of plants in your diet. I think it's good for gut health. I think it's good for getting more fiber in, all of these unique phytonutrients. Then obviously the movement piece is huge. So being an exercise physiologist, I understand the benefits of exercise, but I like to frame it outside of the calorie conversation or the body weight conversation. Primary benefits of exercise for me are related to bone density, muscle mass, the ability for to improve insulin sensitivity, to tolerate glucose better, to improve your heart health through, say, like high intensity interval training. So if people, whether you're a good healthy body weight or not, I think that exercise needs to be a pillar of or let's not even call it exercise. Let's call it movement, because it's a more gentle movement. It could be playing tennis, surfing, golf, going to the gym with a structured program, whatever it is. Just having movement as a pillar of every single day is non-negotiable. I think that we just have to be on our feet more, lifting heavy things, moving our bodies, getting our heart rate up. I think that's just like, think about, and it doesn't matter how you do that. You can do that any way you want. That for me is a non-negotiable.
Yeah, no, that's they're basic and very important. So, Drew, I know that at the age of 22, I think you were, and you just finished your degree in exercise physiology, ironically, you get this diagnosis. That was quite a shock. Tell us about it. Tell us what that diagnosis was.
Yeah, so at the age of about 22, I'd finished university. I had my degree as well. I had my sports science degree. I was actually in the process of getting accredited as an exercise physiologist when I found out about this. But I got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune condition where the immune system destroys the cells of the pancreas that are responsible for producing insulin. So as a result, if you have type 1 diabetes, you have to administer insulin from outside of the body. So multiple daily injections or an insulin pump or an automated insulin delivery system. Type 2 diabetes, the difference between type 1 and type 2 is not autoimmune. The pancreas in the beginning works perfectly fine. It can produce plenty of insulin. In fact, in most cases, it produces too much insulin, hyperinsulinemia. But over time, due to insulin resistance, meaning the insulin's just not working properly, and the pancreas, the beta cell function starts to deteriorate, people with type 2 diabetes can actually need insulin as well from outside of the body, insulin-dependent type 2. So the main difference is autoimmune. The other one is more genetics and lifestyle factors. So being overweight or obese can be a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. There are some dietary elements and sedentary behavior and those kinds of things. But they both fall under this umbrella of hyperglycemia. So diabetes basically just means high blood glucose, but the way that the two manifest are very different.
And you must have gone through this a million times in your head. What do you think the trigger was? What brought this on?
Yeah, I've thought about this many times. Getting diagnosed at 22, especially during that time of my life, I felt like I was in the prime of my life. Life was too good to be true. Everything was great, and then out of nowhere, I get this diagnosis. I mean, there's genetic predisposition could be a part of it. I don't know if I carry certain genes that predispose me to type 1 diabetes. There may be environmental triggers that can create this autoimmune sort of attack or autoimmune response to occur. There are lots of theories around the environmental stuff, but it's so hard to pinpoint exactly what it could have been. It may have been some kind of virus. It could be a gut microbiome change or a shift or a dysbiosis or something in the microbiome. There's lots of theories. But at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter anymore, because once the pancreatic beta cells are destroyed, it's sort of that's it. You're type 1 diabetes for life. While type 2 is a little bit different. If you can reverse the insulin resistance, you can reverse the type 2 diabetes. That's only if you haven't been living with type 2 diabetes for too long, because over time the pancreas can actually lose its ability to function properly. So if you catch type 2 diabetes early, and then you lose a significant percentage of body weight, you clear some of the insulin resistance, you can reverse the condition. But if your pancreas is sort of burnt out, it may be too late and you might have to rely on medication and things like that.
So what were some of the symptoms that drove this, that alerted you to it? How much of a warning did you get?
So the signs and symptoms are very clear and obvious when you know what you're looking for. But at the time, I didn't know what was going on. So rapid weight loss was the first thing I sort of really figured out, was that I was, in just a few weeks, I'd lost 10, 12, I think 15 kilos was the most weight I lost over the journey of being diagnosed. Exhaustion and tiredness, couldn't keep my eyes open, falling asleep, driving to work and, falling asleep all the time. Very thirsty during the day, drinking water, waking up in the night to drink, needing to pee all day and waking up multiple times throughout the night to go to the toilet. So those are sort of the main signs and symptoms. And again, if you don't know what they are, you just think that that's kind of normal. Like you just sort of justify feeling thirsty and needing to go to the toilet. But when it becomes abnormal in terms of the frequency, then you should probably get checked. And a blood test was all it took to sort of figure this out.
Wow. So from beginning to end of onset of symptoms and diagnosis, how long did that take you to establish that?
Well, I actually think that my active lifestyle and the exercise I was doing was keeping me sort of out of hospital for probably months. So I think I would have been unknowingly protecting myself from getting the diagnosis for about 6 months.
Wow.
Because the weight loss was rapid, but I sort of held it for 6 months. So it took me a long, long time before I actually figured out I should get a blood test and see what's going on. And I also think that like the journey, the dietary journey that I've gone on since then has been really like quite interesting because, I got diagnosed and the first thing I did was look for answers. I wanted to know, how can I best manage my blood glucose levels? And at that point, I didn't know you couldn't reverse it. But in my head, I was like, I want to find a way to just reverse this and go back to normal. But the first thing I did was I actually went on a low-carb, whole food paleo diet. So I eliminated grains and legumes and dairy, but I ate fruit and vegetables, nuts and seeds, fish, eggs, all the typical paleo sort of diet. And I was very strict with it. And it was a great management tool in the beginning, especially. I got my insulin requirements down. My blood glucose was nice and stable. I had great diabetes management on a paleo diet. Then I transitioned to a little bit more extreme on the low carb diet, and I went to the keto diet. And for the first couple of months, it was fantastic. Again, my blood glucose management was excellent, very flat line, stable blood glucose, pretty low insulin requirements. But 2 months in on the keto diet, I started to run into some hurdles, which I was sort of in denial about. I couldn't understand how this was happening, but basically I was waking up in the mornings and my fasting blood glucose was slowly elevating every day, week upon week upon week for a couple of months until, so what happened is I wake up in the morning, my blood glucose would be higher than the day before. And then I would wait a couple of days and see if it would normalize, because diabetes is tricky. So there could be stress, sleep, it could be so many things that's causing that. It wouldn't normalize. In fact, it would keep creeping up, this fasting blood glucose. So I started to give more insulin at night, my basal insulin, which is this background insulin dose that essentially is meant to keep you in range overnight. It does what your pancreas would do. It's sort of like, imagine the pancreas overnight is drip feeding insulin to keep you in this tight blood glucose range. So I would give extra basal insulin to try counter that high blood glucose, and it wasn't working. So I'd give more insulin, and the trend continued where I'd give more insulin, but my blood glucose would still be higher and higher over time. So I was a little bit confused about what was going on there. And then I also noticed that at meal times, even if I ate the smallest amount of carbohydrates, the amount of insulin I needed to tolerate those carbohydrates was getting more and more. So my insulin sensitivity was going the other way as well. And I was just perplexed by it, which is what led me to go on the plant-based diet. So basically, I went paleo to keto, and then I went all the way to the other extreme to a plant-based diet with lots of carbohydrates. And now my insulin sensitivity is, the best it's ever been. I can tolerate more glucose for a given unit of insulin than I could ever before, which just goes to show you that there are so many different tools you can use to manage diabetes, right? Like whether you want to do a low-carb approach or you want to do keto or plant-based, figuring out what works for you is part of this journey, and maybe more than one thing can work for you at different times of your life. And I'm obviously plant-based 5 years now, really super happy with the results. My diabetes management's never been better. But I did have success with, the spectrum of macronutrients.
But you now, I guess success is measured in how often you need to inject. Is that how do you, or the blood glucose level?
Yeah, number
How do you measure
Yeah,
success?
I measure success by number one, my time in range. So I wear a continuous glucose monitor, and I
Yep.
have all of this data gets sent to my phone, and I can see in real time the response to meals, and then all this great background analytics of what is what percentage of time is in range, in the range that I've set, and it's over 90%, which is for type 1 diabetes. That's I'm very proud of that. I think
Yes.
the aim, like an endocrinologist or a diabetes educator would say, hey, if you can get to 70%, that's fantastic. So being 90, and some days 100%, like I'll have like a 2 or 3 day stretch of 100%, and I'll just be celebrating that little win. But yeah, like roughly 85 to 90% of my time in range. That's number one. The HbA1c, which is your average blood glucose over 3 months. That's another measure of success, so to speak. Average blood glucose level, like there was times where when I felt like I was really quite insulin resistant during like the back end of the keto diet, where my average blood glucose was actually probably 7.7 or even getting towards 8. And like I would be trying to correct during the day with more insulin, and it wasn't moving. So the insulin wasn't working. My body wasn't very receptive to the signal of insulin. So yeah, I mean, like average glucose, HbA1c, time in range, number of injections is an interesting one, because that was a sort of like my badge of honor when I was low carb. I was like, I only needed a couple of injections a day and very low total insulin. But now I actually use insulin to carb ratio as something that I'm more proud of in terms of how insulin sensitive am I really? If 1 unit of insulin can allow me to eat 20 to 30 grams of carbs, for me, that's a really good measure of insulin sensitivity. Whilst before, when I felt like I was in less insulin sensitive shape, it was like 1 unit of insulin for 5 or 6 grams of carbs. So my
Wow.
response to insulin is something that I think is also really important.
And how often are you injecting, or does one inject on the average as a type 1 diabetic?
Yeah, it can be a lot. So I always have one background dose of insulin, which is sort of lasts for 24 hours. So I do that in the evenings. Some people split that into a morning and an evening, so 12 hours apart. So there's 1 or 2 injections there. And then there's every injection with meals, depending on if they're very low carb, I won't inject for certain meals. But assuming they contain any reasonable amount of carbohydrates, it requires an injection. So that would be 3 meals a day. So already at 5. And then sometimes like a snack, maybe that'll be a 6th injection. And then if for whatever reason my blood glucose is high, I have to give correction doses. So it could be 6, 7, sometimes 8 injections in a day. And this has been 13 years now. So do
Wow.
the math. It's
Yeah, yeah.
thousands of
Yeah, yeah.
injections.
Yeah, and we hear a lot. I mean, this whole expression of low carb means so many different things to so many different people. I mean, at the Atkins initial dose is 20 grams of carb a day. I think it goes up to a higher maintenance
Yep.
dose. When you talk to dietitians who
Higher.
say you could be on 400
No,
grams of carb a day. No, hang on. That's normal. So low carb is 200 grams a day. That's not low
no,
carb,
yeah,
but to a nutritionist, it
right,
is. You've obviously analysed this.
right.
And on a plant-based diet, what's your average carbohydrate intake a day?
So when I'll take you through the journey. So when I was paleo, it was probably 130 grams max, to be honest. Some days probably 90, 100, somewhere around there. Let's say
You were doing a lot of exercise though, weren't
I
you?
was doing a lot of exercise. So yeah,
That's right.
my exercise hasn't really changed that much over the years. The only thing I've really played around with is the dietary pattern. But yeah, paleo day is, let's say, 90 to 130 grams of carbohydrate a day. Keto was significantly lower. That was probably less than 20 grams a day, I'd say, maybe less than 30 grams a day. And I kept that up for about 4 months. And then plant-based, I slowly transitioned my way to a higher carb version of it. I actually started on a lower carb plant-based diet because I wasn't ready to just introduce all these carbohydrates under the conditions I was under. I felt like I'd lost some insulin sensitivity. I couldn't tolerate glucose very well at the end of the keto phase. So I was like, I'll just slowly do it. But it came back quick. Within a couple of weeks, my glucose tolerance was sort of back to normal, and then it sort of improved. But this is something that, even people who are staunch keto advocates know that you lose glucose tolerance. You're changing the kind of like the currency that you're trading in. Like when you're a keto diet, you're great at storing and burning fat, but on a plant-based diet or a high carb diet, you're better at using glucose. So it's just like different. You pick which one, But now I'm eating probably 250 to 350, maybe 400 grams of carbs, if that. I think that would be a huge carb day for me. I think on average, to be honest, like 250.
Wow. Okay. That would still be considered high carb in a lot of people's.
Yeah, for me, that's a significant amount. Yeah.
Yeah, but the proof for you is in literally in the stats, in the numbers,
Right.
and I think this continuous glucose monitor, which you just showed us on the back of your arm. I mean, for you, is that there permanently?
Yeah. So every 10 days, I'll change what the sensor is, but it requires a new sensor to be put in, so you can't reuse it. But yeah, I've been using it probably for a few years now, with maybe 3 or 4 days off in those years. So it's really
it must have revolutionized your testing. I mean, this pinprick testing that is interesting. I mean, I actually think a continuous glucose monitor for everybody for a 2-week period is a great learning experience to see how what you eat affects your blood sugar levels.
Yeah, you can there's so much data that you get from it that it can be overwhelming, and people can get obsessed with these numbers. And I think like a 2-week experiment, there are places for it, especially in populations that are at risk of diabetes or insulin resistance or pre-diabetes. That if you just threw a CGM on everyone with pre-diabetes, or at least on the spectrum of developing it, you're going to probably diagnose a lot of undiagnosed cases, which could be really good. But I do think that a lot of people who are having perfectly healthy responses to meals are pathologizing those responses because they're trying to like keep it so flat. Like it's normal to have fluctuations in blood glucose, especially if they go up and come back down, within an hour or two. If they're elevated for 3, 4, 5 hours, then obviously that's a bit of a problem. But that just comes to the education behind CGM use and learning. Not only does diet influence blood glucose, sleep levels, stress levels, sleep quality and quantity. There's so many factors. So that's the part that I think that these sort of software companies need to nail in on, is what are the other factors that influence blood glucose control, because there are many.
But it's a whole issue around these personal tracking devices anyway, that we can become so preoccupied with it. I mean, I know for a period of time I was wearing an Oura ring, and my wife would ask me in the morning, how did I sleep? And I didn't want to answer her until I checked it out. And she forbade me. She said, I don't want to hear the stats. I just want to hear how you slept.
Yes.
And we can become a bit preoccupied, and it can become stressful.
Right. Like it's almost like stressing about not sleeping may be worse than just the bad night's sleep.
Yes.
I also do that. I check my sleep I use a Whoop, but every morning when I wake up, I look at the sleep stats. But I'm also trying to correlate how I feel. So first I wake up and I think, I actually feel really fresh today. I feel energetic. I'm ready to go to the gym. Let's check the stats. And then if they're correlated, it's like, yep, I knew it. Sometimes they're not though. And then when they're not correlated, the question is, which one do you listen to? Do you listen to how you feel, or do you listen to the data?
Yeah. Well, I think for you who are monitoring as a type 1 diabetic, the kind of monitoring that comes certainly from the glucose monitor is almost a no-brainer. Right. The fact that you've added in all these other devices is another story.
Yeah, true. That is true.
I just want to finish up with one thing, taking a step back from your role in health, your background as an exercise physiologist, because we're all on a health journey through life in this modern world. What do you think the biggest challenge is for us as individuals on that journey?
I think the environment we're in. I really think that the way the world is moving, it's becoming easier and easier to be sedentary. So sitting down for long periods, there's no necessity to move like there used to be. So it's so easy to just sit down all day, operate off a phone or a computer, eat, mindlessly, an influx of calories that you don't care where it's coming from, whether it's ultra processed or whatever. It's just too easy to not move enough and essentially just create poor health outcomes over time. And I think it's the environment we're living in. So we need to have these daily practices to sort of offset the world that we live in. Like if you look at the blue zones, these 5 zones of the world with the most centenarians, these people are living into their hundreds with the least amount of disease, healthy body weights, very functional, physically able, bodies, their environment is set up for longevity. It's up to us to sort of essentially hack our environment to kind of mimic what they're doing. They're growing their own vegetables, they're gardening, they're doing the physical labor. They're not getting someone else to do all those things for them. They're building, they're fixing, they're eating not too many calories. I know we spoke about that, but like we're not overeating. We're not in that. They're not in an obesogenic environment where there's calories are just flowing in. They're able to maintain a really healthy body weight. Their bone density is good. They've got strong joints and muscles. So I think that for everyone at home and who's sort of listening, it's like, how can we create our own little micro environment that mimics something that you would see in a blue zone that, includes all of those things I was just explaining.
Well, Drew, that's a great note for us to finish on. And thank you so much for joining us today. We will, of course, have links to your site. I know you're prolific on your postings and all the information that you share with people. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
I'm so glad we got this done. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it is interesting, isn't it, to hear someone who has gone through all these different diets, from paleo to keto to low carb to plant-based, and who is constantly monitoring his blood sugar level and lands on a plant-based approach to his diet, which is fascinating and obviously important and highlights how personalized nutrition is. And I must say, Drew's Daily Dose, which is his website and Instagram that he has quite a following, he shares all those insights and learnings, but he's well educated and he's well motivated, and he is monitoring and combining his foods regularly and obviously doing it to great benefit. I do ask that question, though, of people who are essentially vegan, and I think they're important questions to ask because something special did happen 6 million years ago when we broke off from the chimps and the gorillas, and we started our journey first as Australopithecus, because when we were gorillas and chimpanzees, our brain capacity was 400 cc's. When we went on to become Australopithecus, we got to around 600. When we were Homo habilis, about 1,000 cc's, or 700 cc's, Homo erectus 1,000 cc's. So our brains were getting bigger, and one would have to ask why, until we landed on anatomically modern humans around 300,000 years ago with a brain capacity, cranial capacity of 1,450 or 1,500 cc's. Now, my question is, how did that happen? And it's a rhetorical question as far as I'm concerned, because I think the answer comes in a nutrient-dense diet. And this is a really interesting, it's why studying human evolution, I believe, and learning from our ancestors is so important. We have much to learn there about what constitutes a nutrient-dense diet. And importantly, essential nutrients are, we have 20 amino acids, of which 9 are essential. We cannot make them ourselves, so we need to consume them. And meat happens to be a very concentrated way of doing that, as well as B12, which is another great challenge that Drew identified, and also omega-3 essential fatty acids, EPA, DHA, ALA. And there's no question that ALA, omega-3 essential fatty acids, are there in walnuts and other seeds and nuts. I think the challenge is to get the DHA and the EPA, and yes, you can do that if you combine well, but an essential fatty acids and essential amino acids are important, and that is why I asked the question about brain development. But the other one is also, is there a society that has thrived generation after generation on a vegan diet? And as far as I know, there isn't. Animals or animal products have been part of our human journey for millions of years. And as one of my mentors, Alan Savory, says, don't blame the resource, as in meat, but blame the way the resource is managed, as in industrial factory farmed meat, which I believe is unconscionable, it's unethical, it's cruel, and what is not good for the animal is not good for us to consume and is not good for the planet, but the opposite is true. What is good for the animal is good for us, and it's good for the planet. So all very interesting. I think, though, fascinating to see somebody like Drew, who, as I said, is monitoring his blood sugar very, very closely and is obviously very in tune with not only his own body chemistry, how he's feeling, but how to combine foods effectively and making it work for him. I thought it was a fascinating conversation. We'll have links to Drew's daily dose on the show notes. I would encourage you also to join our Unstress Health community. Some great resources there, some great programs about exploring stress, the 5 Stressor program, exploring the 5 pillars of health to build resilience, and focusing on mindset through positive intelligence and identifying your saboteurs, all on our Unstress Health platform. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.